so beautiful. Well, if you've been with us this summer, you know that we are dedicating the summer to God. Kind of unusual, right, for a spiritual community? We're working with Paul Smith's book, Is Your God Big Enough, Close Enough, You Enough? And we've worked through big enough. We've talked about God being an infinite being, principles, something that we can rely on. We've also talked about God being something close, something that's personal to you, something that you can sort of slide up to in your prayer time. Sometimes you'll have a sense of walking with that. I've noticed when a lot of you talk about it, there'll be a persona to it, that maybe that presence becomes Jesus or becomes Mother Mary or something you can kind of get your hands on, right? But that's another way that we connect with this thing that we call God. Now today, we're moving into a different relationship, which is being God. Is your God you enough? And Paul Smith does a nice job of tying this into consciousness. And consciousness is not a new term for those of us in Unity. And we're really sort of lucky in Unity because this aspect of the relationship with God, where we are invited to really be God, is something we talk about all the time. And so let's jump in, see what we can learn. From a standpoint of consciousness, Paul starts us out by just putting the baseline at basic consciousness. And here's what he says about it. Basic consciousness is the way we function in the physical world. It includes our thoughts, feelings, intentions, values, memories, and sense of self. It's far from the ordinary. It's incredible and spectacular. It's vital for our high level of functioning in the world. However, by itself, basic consciousness is a relatively limited awareness in terms of the reality beyond the physical material realm. In basic awareness, we only know reality as that which can be seen, heard, smelled, and touched by our ordinary senses. So you get that all of us have basic consciousness. Now it's interesting, it's better developed in some people than others. We've all met people, right, that don't function very well in the world. They're off somewhere. But for most of us, we understand basic functioning, we understand basic consciousness, and we do a pretty good job of functioning in the world. The challenge with basic consciousness is that by its nature, it's very grounded in the world. It's funny that the Unity Seminary is in Missouri, and it was fun for me to learn when I moved there to go to seminary that their whole theme in Missouri is the see me state, or the show me state, you know. See, you guys have it better than me. Are you a Missourian? Yeah, so Cindy pointed to herself and said, so the show me state. So do you see, we don't generalize, but in that consciousness, that's, yeah, I want to touch it, feel it, taste it. But the challenge is then that it's you. There's no orientation to something greater from that consciousness. So you're on your own. And it's very easy from that place to feel powerless to life, to feel victimized by life, to feel insecure because you've got to be watching everything, right? You're the one. And so from that place, from that insecurity, we often live a life that's one down or from a kind of a collapsed place. Or out of that insecurity, we get really grandiose and puffed up and act like it's not impacting us. Either way, we're cut off. We're on our own. It's definitely a place where the individual self rules. In contrast, then, Paul says that and I spent some time in the first service going through this, he makes it sound like you're moving through levels of consciousness. And I guess in some ways you are, but I just want to point out that in these different manifestations of consciousness, we might say that you can move from one to the other. And we experience that, right? Like, you know the experience of something coming up in your life, like your company suddenly lays you off, for example. It can tend to pull us back down into a pretty basic consciousness. How am I going to survive? Oh my God, I got to take charge here. And so we can move, depending on how open our soul is, to often any of these levels that we're going to talk about. They're not necessarily in order. But he poses the next level, as awakened consciousness. And here's what he says about it. Here we wake up from the usual way that we see our story, our wounds, failures, and successes, and move into a larger world. Here we are free of the limitations of the physical body and thinking mind, but still attached to needs, desires, and personality. Here people wake up to new awareness of God. They begin to hear God's voice in a new way. Spiritual gifts are abilities that are especially opened up here. Christianity was born in massive demonstrations of this mystical consciousness, accompanied by deep feelings of ecstasy, as reported by the participants. In awakened consciousness, we do not relate to God as principle, but as a personal being, a non-physical, divine, loving being with intent and consciousness. Here we are relating as one being to another. So you can feel the change in that, can't you? That we're beginning to open up, that there is something bigger at play in our lives. And from that, then, our lives have an opportunity to really open up. Now, Paul comes from a Baptist background, and I had the great pleasure of attending Paul's church when I was in seminary in Kansas City. One of my classmates turned me on to it. He had a healing service on Wednesdays, and it was wild, you know. And so he talks about these awakened experiences, you know, that it's an experience of waking up. And he talks about trances and talking in tongues or channeling or getting slayed in the spirit. And the list goes on, right? And indeed, those things happen at his church. But in unity, and by the way, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. We do not exclude anything in unity. You know, it's interesting. So, for example, we loved him, and we asked him, our whole class, all 40 of us, went to his church to spend a day with him. And at the end of, he's like a master in spiritual gifts, but at the end of it, he said, well, you know, how many of you guys are manifesting the Spirit? You know, like, how many of you can speak in tongues? I'm this little kid raised in unity, right? Oh, no one's going to raise their hand. 50% of my class raised their hand. And he says, you know, well, let's get up and get, all of a sudden they're talking in a language that I can't understand. It's like the Tower of Babel's going on, right? And then 3 of my classmates start interpreting it. It was truly amazing and really opened me up to the diversity that was in our class and that could be sitting in this room. Tremendous diversity. I won't make you raise your hands, but we'll be doing speaking in tongues in my office later. But here's what I love about unity, that our focus is on practical Christianity. And another way that we could put that is that Charles and Myrtle Fillmore were interested in embodying what they were experiencing. You know, we can all have spiritual experiences that wake us up. And in fact, be leery. There's a lot of spiritual teachers out there that had a pretty dramatic awakening experience and think they're awake. Well, we know it's a difference between having one experience and beginning to then live from that consciousness. Usually we have to clear some stuff away. We have to begin to really open and let that become stationed in us. It's a totally different thing than just experiencing it, and the Fillmores had some understanding of that. They were always encouraging us to practice, and they were encouraging us to recognize that God, Spirit, was going to work through us in our unique ways. So not to compare ourselves to others and to have the same experience as others. So my awakening felt much more gradual to me, and it actually happened, I would say The groundwork was done in the youth and family program at Unity of Des Moines, Iowa, where we had an amazing teacher when I was probably in the 6th grade. And she just had us begin to look at how life works. And she would talk to the class and get each of us to identify something that we desired or something we'd like to see happen in our lives. And she'd talk to us about how important it is, can you set that intention? And when you set the intention, can you also look at what comes up that might be blocking it? What beliefs do you have that come up that say, well, that's never going to happen to me, or my parents will never go for that, or whatever it is, right? But then she did another thing that really started to open it up for me. And she said, and I want you to watch the things that happen in your life and the people that come into your life to support that thing that you have begun to focus your attention on. And that little group, I think there were about 10 in my class, we came in every week with testimonials, you know. We were like, wow, this is amazing. The things that we as individuals could not explain. We of ourselves did not know that very person that stepped into our life to help us to bring forth that which we needed. And I began to be a believer, which is gently moving me out of this basic consciousness into a awakened consciousness. Now, a couple of things. There's a broad spectrum of awakened consciousness. And as a unity movement, we're moving along that spectrum. When I was a kid, the end point really was when you had manifested the perfect life. We have grown so much. So that means, and a lot of people in Unity are kind of hooked there, right? So you learn that you can set intention, just that whole process that I just said, and you're like, oh, that's all I need. Now I get to create everything that I want. Let's go. Who is creating that? Would be your individual self. And so as we move along the continuum, as we continue to step out in bigger ways, we can begin to develop more trust, which is a process also then of often letting go. And we begin to see that the universe loves us so much that it's unfolding the perfect life for you. That you don't need to be holding an idea of everything that's happening, that it's like putting more opportunity your way than you can almost claim. And supporting you through the process, which is not always pretty and fun. Often we need to be shook up. We need to be broken open to invite even more of who we are. So, a couple of things. How do we, well, let me go back to one other thing, kind of a fun story. So when I was growing up, my mom's best friend was a channeler. And have you all had exposure to channelers? Yeah. So here's this very feminine woman who, when the entity that she channeled came in, it was this husky guy. You know, so you knew something was going on, right? Either she really knew how to change her voice or somebody descended in her. And it was fascinating. I sat in many a session of group with her where I learned a lot. I went home after college for a visit, and my parents were having, this woman and her husband over for dinner, as well as our family, and I was asking her about her channeling, and she said, it's interesting, Scott, I don't channel any longer. I simply feel like that wisdom, that knowing, is just available to me all the time. And I said, well, how do you explain that? And while this was over 30 years ago, so I can't tell you exactly what she said, I distinctly remember the flavor was, I'm not sure that I could open to that wisdom where I was at, in consciousness, we might say. So I could open to some deity coming into me, some entity, and bringing wisdom, but I couldn't own to the fact that I was the expression of that wisdom, that I was God in expression at that moment. But she said, as I did it over and over again, I began to relax into the process. And now it happens, and I love that she said, as me. It's not God doing something through me. It's not something I have to be powerless to. It's happening. And I don't always know if, sometimes it's not as clear as others, but it's happening. Gives us a sense of this continuum of awakening, and to recognize that it's good to have some sense of where we are on the continuum. How much do I really trust that I am the expression? Isn't it funny? As I said in the opening prayer, God, when God was asked, what's your name? I am. And if you think about it, when you're in the middle of some amazing wisdom, some direct knowing, some intuition comes, as you relax more into that, there's not much of you there except that. What are you? I am guidance. Or in this moment, I am strength. Because the small sense of yourself, the usual sense, doesn't need to be there in the way it used to. It doesn't need to be taking care of you as it used to. So all of us here are being invited into the process of maturing our souls, becoming more and more receptive containers for what we already are, for the magnificence, the unlimited nature of being that manifests in this location. So, Paul, I think, does a beautiful job of reminding us how we can not only make the transition from basic consciousness to this awakened consciousness, but how we can continue to move along awakened consciousness is through mindfulness. Mindfulness is being present to the moment, bringing yourself back to the moment. One of the things that I've learned in the Ridwan School where I teach is the power of sensing our arms and our legs. If you can sense your arms and your legs, you're here. If you can't, then you're probably triggered, you're caught in a story from the past, or you're daydreaming about how it's going to be in the future to try and get the heck out of this moment. But you see, what the moment holds, and the beauty of the moment, is either you're in some kind of expanded place, some kind of spacious, spirit's naturally spacious, right? Or you've got something that you're blocking up against, right? You're feeling contracted, you're feeling, could be feeling checked out. There's any number, you could be angry, there could be any number of things that would tell you, there's something here that I can look at. And our willingness to look at things is what frees us up. Because you see, we can shut down spirit really quickly. You may know the story of King David in the Bible. He was one pretty lit up guy. He was, he was awakened. I don't know if he was enlightened, but for a king in the Old Testament, he was pretty awakened. You probably remember the story. 2 women were brought to him, both claiming that they were the mother of the same child. And, oh, that's Solomon. Okay, well, throw that story out. Let's just change the names. It works better that way. Oh, there we go. See, it passed down through the lineage. Oh, well, busted. No one in the first service busted me on this. Oh, I didn't share that story. God was looking out for me at the first service. Not this one. Goodness. Okay, well, let's stick to David. So David was considered to be, a very great king, but he had a little bit of a challenge with Bathsheba. Do you remember this? She was a married woman. He saw her. He fell in love with her, and they did the hanky-panky. And she got pregnant. And so he wanted to cover his tracks. What consciousness would that be from? Pretty basic, right? Not staying in your integrity, not being honest about what's going on. Let's cover our tracks because we are separate here. And to be gentle with yourself because this is what we do. And this is when we see it, we have an opportunity to do something differently. So as a result, he basically set her husband up to be killed. And he was afterwards feeling a lot of guilt and a lot of shame for that. In fact, he wrote the 51st Psalm. It reads this way: "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain in me a willing spirit." So you see, he's feeling cut off. And this is what happens when, what's happening for him, if he's feeling shame and guilt, most likely his judge is on him, right? And there's always some element of truth in what we're being judged for, but the judge doesn't know where to stop. And so what happens is it robs us then of all the capacities that are God in us, their spirit in us. And so, if we could be there with him to help him defend, and then to begin to look at why. Why did you participate in this act? What was going on for you? Because you see, that's freeing up his soul, freeing him up to be yet a more free vessel to just let Spirit move as Spirit had before. And so if you find yourself tightened down, we all do it. We say something we regret, and then the judge gets on us, or we do something we wish we hadn't. We are, again, not powerless, but these are opportunities for us to learn, to take a deep breath, to practice what we learn as being good skills for moving back to who we are, back to that expanded state. Can you feel the quiet in the room? As we move into awakened consciousness, there's a quieting of the mind. There can be a luminous blackness. I thought Blackbird was a truly synchronous song today. And a true sense of freedom. And so it is to our advantage to recognize that there's basic consciousness, but we move from there to awakened consciousness. That in awakened consciousness we come to understand that not only is there a higher power, but that higher power manifests as us in truly amazing ways. And as we begin to clear our channel of that by working our gifts, and by the way, mindfulness is supported by our main practice of prayer and meditation. Each of those is intended to bring us back, to allow us to focus, to not be lost in our reactivity, but to recognize, to name it, to come back. And to understand that there is no place to get to in consciousness. There is always more joy, more peace, more love, always showing up in fresh and new ways to support you in the light that you are. And so I want to invite you to begin to prepare your love offerings as we allow ourselves to be blessed again through music.